The water was high at that point in time. And so just something to think about when you're out on the refuge, that where headquarters is today, you would have been standing underwater. So I always love that, to stand there and go, ooh, I was under the lake. Let's see if it'll do this. Oh goodness. Doesn't want, okay, gotta do this. Okay, so Janelle mentioned the Northern Paiute. The Burns Paiute Tribe are descendants of the first people who were in the basin. We know that Northern Paiutes were in the Harney Basin at least 17,500 years ago. On BLM, Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter is being excavated annually, and they keep going deeper and deeper and older and older. It's a phenomenal site. You can find a little bit about it in the news, and it's just, they're finding some amazing things out there. On the refuge itself, we have dates that go back to 9,800 years ago on Malheur and Harney Lakes, and these are from excavations. So we're looking at a fairly deep time period there. And the headquarters site where Refuge headquarters is located is dated to 6,000 years ago. So we know that there's a long, deep history of use of the basin by Native Americans. They were using a wide variety of resources. They were at winter village sites on the lakes. Think about where you would want to be in winter when it's snowy and nasty outside. You want to be down at the lowest elevation, and that's Malheur Lake. They were also in the Double O area and on Harney Lake. We don't have a lot of evidence that they had winter village sites in the Blitzen Valley, but I would not discount that because we have a lot of archaeology there. And, you know, the Blitzen Valley is not too shabby in the wintertime. So about 3,500 years ago, we see the longest or the most sites with the most people at them. And that's during a period that's moist and a little bit wetter. We've got a lot of snowpack up on the mountains. We've got the lake is a little bit larger. It's not super deep, but it's large enough that we've got very extensive marsh resources. And it's when we start seeing a lot of sites showing up in the Blitzen Valley. And then about 1,400 years ago, there's a drought, a very severe drought. And it appears that all of the use in the Harney Basin moves to higher elevations on Steens Mountain and places like that. We see an increase in sites up there with fewer sites down in the basin itself. People are moving up to where springs are for water. But we see after about 1,050 years ago, when we have a cold and very moist episode and the lake expands greatly, as the lake diminishes, people start moving back down into the basin, and we appear to have almost continuous occupation after that by the Northern Paiute. So the Northern Paiute had a seasonal round, and it's very interesting to look at how they used the landscape. In the winter time, they're clustered around the lakes. Think about the resources that are coming in. If you've got fairly decent water coming into the area, and we know that the headquarters spring, before some of the wells were put in the area, produced huge amounts of water. It always had open water. It was very rare when I was there for the pond at the spring to ice over. So you've got reliable water there. There was water coming down the Silvies River. So you've got some good water resources also at Double O, the series of springs over there. In the spring, they moved to the foothills to collect roots. And this is over towards Stinking Water Pass. So then the northeastern part of the Harney Basin. They're going up there. They're having access to some resources along the Malheur River. They're in the higher elevations. And we're talking April, May. And then late spring, they actually moved down on the Malheur River for salmon and steelhead. And this is because before the dams were put in, there was a steady movement of fish up the river every year. It was a very reliable resource for individuals to access there. So, and then in summer, it appears that they moved into the Blitzen Valley, and they moved into more temporary camps at a little bit up on top of some of the buttes, a little bit away from the water so that there was a good breeze to keep the mosquitoes away, because we've all had experience with those mosquitoes. And then in the fall, they move up onto Steens Mountain. Some of this is for collection of fruits and berries that might be up on the mountain, but also they're hunting some of the ungulates up there. And then after that, in the late fall, the Paiute tribes or bands would get together for what they would call fandango gatherings. And these are events where they're doing a massive scale pronghorn hunt, and they move around. They're not in the same area. It appears that every 7 or 8 years they would come to the area occupied by a particular band of Paiutes, and the hunting would go on there. And they're using game drives to move the pronghorn into a corral or a box canyon, and they're culling out some of the older pronghorn. And it's a time when they have gaming going on. Young people get to meet their prospective mates, because tribes and bands of Native Americans are very aware of that they have to spread genetics out within the group. I guess that's a nice way of putting it. And so it's very important. And also one reason why you would want to have a son or daughter married to somebody in another band is if it gets really bad in the area where you are resource-wise, there's a relative in another band that perhaps can help you with some of the resources that you need. So, and there's a lot of trading that goes on, things like that. So I wanted to show you, this is the result of excavations that have occurred on the refuge. So these are a very rough, this was done before we had all the nice digital mapping capabilities out there. But these are locations and dates where we found different fish species. Tui chub or minnows, which are still in the system, were a very popular fish to procure in the area. And in the Northern Great Basin and the Great Basin, they're a very popular fish. They're easy to catch. They grow to a certain size. They were dried, sometimes smoked, and they can be used for longer periods of time. You will notice, though, that we've got some red-band trout showing up at a few locations. There was actually trout at the Narrows. And one interesting thing at the Narrows, I mentioned that 22,000-year-old fish, that was actually a steelhead salmon. And it appears that the salmon came in to that area and they were spawning under, and then later that was covered with a volcanic ash. So some of the fish that we still care about today were being procured all the way back 8,000 years ago, 8 to 10,000 years ago. And these are just based on the remains that show up. Some of you may have had the opportunity to help with surveys out on the Harney Dunes. This is a fish roasting pit on the Harney Dunes that was uncovered after the flooding of the 80s. We did a small excavation in it. Let's just say that somebody wasn't paying attention to the fire, and the fire got a little too hot, and basically all the fish in the pit turned to creosote, which was huge for us because we could recover entire fish during the excavation. So they dug a hole, a large pit. This is about 4 feet across. and they put grass down on the bottom. They laid the fish in layers with a little bit of grass between them. They covered it up with grass, then they put soil on top, and then they built a fire using greasewood. And we were able to identify that it was greasewood based on some of the material that was left. And each of these pits probably had 1,000 to 2,000 tui chub in them. And for some reason that we don't know what happened, there was a whole series of these roasting pits along the face of the dunes that all of the fish turned to creosote in them. So it got a little bit too hot, and that was that. So ways that they would have caught fish, and probably what was happening at Harney Dunes is that a gill net was being used. So we have found the net weights in piles at archaeological sites on the refuge. So we know they were using nets. So they were making these nets either out of dogbane, which is in the hemp family, or you can actually use the inner bark of sagebrush. There are a lot of plants that you can actually use to make twine out of. And so there were a number of, there are huge numbers of plants on the refuge today that you can be used for twine. So they could have also been making hooks, composite fish hooks. And we know that on the Malheur River, they were using fish weirs or baskets that were set up, and the fish would swim into them and get caught, or they could use dip nets, which was very common along the Columbia River at places like the Dalles. So they had a lot of resources that they could use to capture not only fish, but we know that in the Northern Great Basin, they also were capturing waterfowl. And you go, waterfowl? What? So we all know that in the fall or late summer, that the majority of waterfowl lose their flight feathers. And you've seen them, they'll run across the top of a pond to get away from you, but they don't fly away. Well, of course, the Native Americans were aware of this. They probably are more aware of the habits of animals than we ever would be. And so they took the opportunity to capture large numbers of waterfowl in the late summer and early fall, and then process those birds so that they would have meat during the winter time. So it's all about having opportunities to get food that will last you through the winter. So all the root resources that were gathered with not only eat those right away and over the summer, but to prepare and store them for winter use. So and I will say this, everything that was procured was used. So bones were used for things. I like to think of these early populations of Native Americans as the first recyclers. They used absolutely everything. Nothing went to waste. Absolutely nothing went to waste. We have a lot we could learn from them today. So if you've had the opportunity to go up on to Buena Vista to the rock art, it's in a closed area. It's had some vandalism, so it was closed off. We have been left with some incredible rock writing. And we had a couple of opportunities to map out that rock writing. And we believe that a lot of what is depicted there, there's some stuff that we could only see after photographing it. These series of dots and stuff, we believe that it goes back at least 8,000 years. So a very long history of use. I'm not going to say that I can tell you what is depicted here and why. That is for the individual artist that was, or shaman that was putting the writing up on these walls and left them behind for us to puzzle about. But they're just incredible to see. So our first views that we had of what the basin looked like were from Peter Skeen Ogden. So he came into the area in 1826. He came for the purpose of procuring beavers, otters, and things like that for the fur trade. He worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. So, and he talks about seeing Native Americans on the north side of the lake, which is really interesting. So he wrote that we can't go 10 yards without finding them. They live in grass huts. So these are probably semi-subterranean pit houses that have a tule and cattail mat cover. They, unfortunately, when Ogden and his crew of over 100 people came into the area, these are not small groups of trappers, they expected any Native Americans that they encountered to share food with them. And it had apparently been a drought year, and not a lot of food resources were there. And so the Paiutes did not share with them. And it was not something that Ogden was very happy about. And they also, because they stayed on the north side of the lakes and didn't discover the Blitzen Valley, they didn't find any beaver. And they didn't have the Paiutes didn't have any beavers furs to trade with them. So after trying to hunt a little bit, get some food, Ogden just headed on to the Klamath country, and he named the area Misfortune, or Malheur in French. And he also thought that the lakes connected with the Malheur River, and that's how the Malheur River got its name, even though we know that at this point in time, there was no connection. So the next occurrence of Europeans into the basin is in 1845 in the Stephen Meeks wagon train. So somehow Meeks convinced about 800 people that he knew a shortcut from the Oregon Trail to get over to the Willamette Valley. And we're very fortunate that the diary of Eli Casey Cooley was passed down through his family, and they eventually published it. And he talks about coming over Stinking Water Pass, dropping down into the basin. And he talks about getting close to and along the north side of Malheur Lake. So they crossed over Silver Creek and then came down Silver Creek. And actually, they came down the Silvies River, hit Malheur Lake, realized that there was no drinkable water once they left the river, headed on towards Harney Lake, got to Silver Creek, had access to some water, and then headed west from there. And they were miserable. And they were sure that they were lost, and nobody knows why anybody would ever go that way. And they ended up going back up to the regular Oregon Trail to make their way to the Willamette Valley. So a puzzle, but apparently Stephen Meeks was a really good salesman. Then in 1853, the Elijah Elliott wagon train comes through the area. Well, he had read about Meeks's account, and he got to the basin, came in about the same general way, and he thought, well, I'll go down around the south side of the lake, and there'll be water down there. And so they did, and they had difficulty crossing the Blitzen River, and they had to go fairly far south near Rattlesnake Butte, where the first wood tower is on the refuge, and they crossed the river there. And they continued on around the south side of Harney Lake. There are a few not very great springs over there, and they were running out of water. We have no accounts from this. I wasn't able to find any diaries from anybody. And they started wandering their way towards Central Oregon. They were all sure they were going to die. And eventually some riders from Central Oregon found them out in the middle of nowhere and led them back to the Bend area. And guess what? They all went north and joined the Oregon Trail that went along the river. So 2 events, we have nothing about Native Americans mentioned in these accounts, but I'm sure if I was a Native American and I saw trails of people in wagons coming through, I'm not sure I would be very friendly and want to put myself out there. So then in 1859 and 1860, a series of military expeditions come into the basin. They were sent by General William S. Harney. He was out of a fort in the Vancouver area, and they were looking for routes for a military road to the Snake River. They didn't want to continue having to go along the Columbia River to get over there. They encountered Paiutes in the valley. They talk about coming upon some small villages in the Blitzen Valley. This is in the summertime, and that they had been abandoned. Fires were still going, food was laying around, everything had just been left, and there were no people. By this time, Native Americans have already had really bad encounters with the US military, so it's not a surprise that they just left until the military got out of the way. So many of the area landmarks that we're familiar with were named by the military. So Harney Lake was named after General Harney because he had sent the expeditions there. Steens Mountain, it was named after Enoch Steens, who was the captain leading the expeditions. And the Donner und Blitzen River received its name because many of the soldiers that were on the military expedition were actually German, and they were paid mercenaries to be in these military expeditions. And they were there in the summertime. And if you've been there in the summertime, you know that we get some really good thunder and lightning events. And so Donner und Blitzen means thunder and lightning. So that's how the river got its name. Fort Harney was established in 1867 in the northern part of the basin. And you can still go to visit where it was. Today, I believe the Historical Society put a interpretive panel marker there. So unfortunately for the Native Americans in the area, the US government, of course, decided that all of the Native Americans needed to go onto an Indian reservation. So in 1872, a reservation was negotiated, and it was the Malheur River Indian Reservation. And if you look at this map, it's all of the area in pink. And I believe it was close to 2 million acres in size. Unfortunately, settlers coming into the area did not pay attention to those reservation boundaries. And the Indian agent that was in charge did very little to keep settlers from encroaching upon the reservation. And it led to some difficulties, but we'll get back to that later. So I wanted to mention Charles Bendire, who was a captain with the US military. He was stationed at Fort Harney in 1874. He was a physician. He is better known as an ornithologist and an oologist, who later worked with the Smithsonian on the oological displays that they have there. Those are egg collections. So he documents the first bird observations in Harney Valley and the first bird observations on Malheur Lake. He actually found a small rowboat and was able to get out on Malheur Lake. So we know the water was fairly deep at that point in time. And he rode his way south on the lake and ended up at where headquarters is today. And he entered it, the large spring that comes out from the hill. And he talks about swarms of suckers, about 18 inches long and red on the sides. We now know that these are probably red-band trout, but he didn't think that there would be a trout species there. He camped there. And then he began seeing birds showing up. And what showed up were 100 to 150 pelicans, American white pelicans, formed a semicircle and drove the fish into an area so that they could eat them. So he documents some of the very first bird observations in the Harney Basin. And in 1877, he publishes Birds of Southeast Oregon and lets the world know about the abundant bird resources and other resources that are in the basin. This is good in some ways, but it's bad in some other ways, and I will talk about that in a little bit. So in 1878, some Bannock Indians in Idaho had a dispute with the Indian agent and decided they weren't going to put up with the US government trying to control their actions. And the Bannock Indian War exploded. And unfortunately, it spread into the Harney Basin a little bit. We don't know really how many of the Northern Paiutes on the reservation were involved, but it was enough that the military and the Indian agent decided that all of the Northern Paiutes on the Malheur River Reservation would be moved to Fort Simcoe, which was on the Yakima Reservation, and 14 other tribes were moved there as well. So they were forced in a march, just like we hear about the Trail of Tears of the tribes from the Southeast being forced to move to Oklahoma. The same happened to the ancestors of the Burns Paiute, and they were moved to Fort Simcoe in the wintertime. There was a lot of death. And because there were no longer any Native Americans on the reservation, in 1883, Congress decided to dissolve the reservation, because if there aren't any Indians there, why have a reservation? So that was the end of Paiutes in the area until much later when they were allowed to return. And I'm not going to go into that history. If you want to learn about that, the Burns Paiute has an excellent history page about their very recent history. So today we have members from the tribe who participate in collecting activities primarily on the refuge. When I was there and we were excavating, we would invite tribal members out to participate in the excavations and learn about their history from the archaeology as well. So it was a very great opportunity for me to develop a nice relationship with the tribe. But I encourage you to go to the Burns Paiute website and learn more about their history from them. So we all know about Peter French. I'm not going to talk too much about Peter. I could talk for hours about Peter. So he came to Oregon from California. He was hired by Hugh Glenn, who was a dentist out of the Sacramento area. He arrived in 1872 with 6 vaqueros, a cook, 1,200 head of cattle. He eventually located the south end of the Blitzen Valley and began what was ultimately one of the largest private ranches in the country. In 1883, he married Hugh Glenn's daughter while he was on a visit to Sacramento to talk with the boss. On their way back from Sacramento to the P Ranch, Hugh Glenn was shot, and his daughter turned around and went back to San Francisco or Sacramento and never came to the Blitzen Valley. So it was its own little soap opera there going on. French was murdered in 1897, and the ranch went through a number of ownership changes after his death. There are several very good books that talk about Pete French and his ranching that he did. But I wanted to show you the map on the left shows some of the holdings. And this was a map that was put together by one of our volunteers when I was at the refuge. So the green are areas that were owned in fee title by the ranch. The areas in yellow are areas that were controlled by the ranch because they had control over strips of property that allowed them to exclude anyone else from coming through their property to use these other areas. So along the base of Steens, you can see the whole Blitzen Valley all the way up. So the ranch was at 140,000 deeded acres by the 1897. So French and Glenn used various acts to acquire property: the Homestead Act, the Swampland Act, the Desert Land Act, and direct purchase, either from willing or unwilling sellers. So French was not the least bit afraid of going and intimidating some of the settlers, especially those living along the south side of Malheur Lake. And he would cut fences and intimidate people until they finally just sold them their property. There was a lawsuit settled in 1901 after French's death by one of the settlers on the south side of Malheur Lake. The case went to the U.S. Supreme Court and ruled in favor of the settlers, that said that the ranch could not say they owned everything to the high water mark of the lake, and that included when the lake was almost dry. So they were trying to say that they had boundaries that fluctuated. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, nope, you don't. And this also led the way, eventually gave the U.S. government the ability to create the refuge. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So there are many landscape modifications that date from the Eastern Oregon Land and Livestock Company. So where most of the roads are on the refuge, with the exception of the Center Patrol Road, those roads were put in for ranch operations. Ditches were put in and later expanded by the CCC. Haying and grazing began on the refuge under the company. And many of the fences that are still in place today were put in during those operations. And after French's death and subsequent owners of the ranch, between 1907 and 1913, the Blitzen River was channelized. And this was to improve opportunities for irrigation. And they actually were planning to have small dairy farms in the Blitzen Valley. And at this point in time, by 1913, the railroad had come into the area, and they were hoping that they would be able to send milk and dairy products out on the railroad, but it was never an operation that worked very well. So today, what we see, some of the river channelization especially, and the locations of some of the ditches and the fields on the refuge, are the result of these later ranching operations. So you've probably all been to P Ranch. You may not know that at the height of the ranch, there were 21 buildings there. So a wide array. I believe there's an interpretive panel at the ranch that has a map showing where all of those were. Sod House Ranch was established first by putting fences up so that they could claim the area. A homestead house was moved into the area. One of the ranch hands claimed the area, his 200 acres. And then with the ranch paying for improvements, he proved up the homestead sold it to the ranch, and then they actually just moved the homestead house to the next parcel and did the same thing. Eventually, over 9,000 acres were managed out of Sod House Ranch. And this is when some of the issues with homesteaders on Malheur Lake developed. The long barn, which is still, I hope, in great condition today. I hear the doors have a little bit of a problem, was constructed in 1888. And there were 15 buildings at the ranch during the height of its operation. Double O Ranch was established in 1855. It was a partnership between Riley, Hardin, and Taylor. The town of Riley is named after this gentleman. In 1878, when the Bannock War came into the area, some of the Bannocks got over into the Double O area and they burned down all of the buildings. All of the ranchers in the area had moved to Fort Harney by this point in time, so no one was hurt. They stole all of the livestock that were there and moved them over towards the Riley area. Later recovered, but the Double O Ranch was the third largest in Harney County until it was purchased in 1903 by William Hanley, who later became a U.S. Senator from Oregon. He owned the Belay Ranch and he combined the Double O with that ranch, and it became the second largest ranch in the county. So he made huge improvements as well at the Double O. Many of the ponds that we see today were begun during that point in his ownership. He was really into wildlife, and his wife really appreciated wildlife. So while he ran cattle on the area, he developed it as prime wildlife habitat, moving water into places that would be beneficial for wildlife. And he was a great hunter, and so he would have people come out to hunt on the property. But his wife also enjoyed just seeing the variety of wildlife that would come into the area. And as we all know, in the spring, it's a great place to see wildlife. So homesteads around the lake. We know that the first homestead happened around 1875 when Pete Stenger constructed a sod structure at today's Refuge headquarters. So this is how the area acquired its name. And by the late 1880s, settlers are building shacks on the lake bed for farming. And as the water level fluctuates, they would move back and forth. In this image, this little structure right here is the original sod house. So this is where the spring and the headquarters pond is today, but it was at one point in time, it was open and flowed all the way out to Lake Malheur, which is off in this area. You can see the variety of homes from settlers that are out across the lake bed. So I wanted to talk about William Finley and Herman Bowman. So they read Ben Deere's account of birds of Southeast Oregon and the wide variety of birds that were available. And they decided that they were going to come to Harney Basin. William Finley's grandson and his wife have written an absolutely fabulous book about Finley and Irene Finley, and I've got it in my bibliography at the end. I highly recommend reading it. William and Irene were huge conservationists at a time when conservation wasn't really even identified as something. But they arrived. William and Herman were photographers, and they did a lot of documenting of wildlife all around the area. But they arrive in the Harney Basin. There are no roads into the Blitzen Valley. They come down the Silvies River looking for white herons, which we now know are great egrets, and they see no birds. There are only nests. They get to the Narrows, and they learn from the merchant at the Narrows that plume hunters had come into the area in 1898. and gone out while the birds were nesting and just shot everything they could, took the plumes off of the egrets because they were still in breeding plumage, left the young birds to die, and took everything and left. So they saw one white heron on Malheur Lake in the week to 2 weeks that they were rowing around on the lake. And they realized that something had to be done about it. And so here's a photo that Bowman took of William Finley on Malheur Lake in 1908. So it must have been a deeper lake at that point in time, because we're not seeing a lot of cattails and tules out there. But they did talk about the other birds that they saw. And Finley published an article in the Atlantic Monthly in 1910 that talked about his experience on Malheur Lake in 1908. And he talks about the huge colonies of gulls and white pelicans, the most he's ever seen. And he says I love this. I got so excited, I tripped over one of the oars and fell overboard with 3 plate holders in my hand. These are glass plates that they're putting into the camera. These are some of the photos that they took. They've been hand colored. You can access them off of our National Conservation Training Center archives website. They belong to the Portland Audubon Society, who allowed Fish and Wildlife to scan them for digital preservation. But you can see the wide variety of photos that they were able to take of the birds when they were out on the lake. So it's a pretty phenomenal opportunity that they had before things got too bad out there. So Finley was one of the founding members of the Oregon Audubon Society, which later became the Portland Audubon Society. So he goes back to Portland and he says, we need to do something. We cannot let this devastation continue in Southeast Oregon. They also had been to Klamath Basin and saw the same thing happen there. They happened to be members of various organizations that Theodore Roosevelt was also a member of. So in 1908, after their visit to Malheur, Finley goes to Washington and he convinces Teddy Roosevelt to create Malheur as a bird reservation. So it became the Malheur Lake Reservation at that point in time. It's 81,000 plus acres. That little lawsuit that happened in 1901 that the Supreme Court settled declared that anything that wasn't already settled on the lake was government property, and not just state property, it was federal government property. So this allowed Teddy Roosevelt to declare the Malheur Bird Reservation. And so it was initially managed by the Bureau of Biological Survey out of Washington, D.C. Didn't work out real good having things be so remote. The Bureau of Biological Survey eventually morphed into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So Finley, who'd kept his eye out on what was happening at the new bird reservation, realized that people were still hunting, they were illegal occupation, they were trespassing. And in 1911, he's appointed as the first state game warden for Oregon. And one of the first things he does is he hires a bunch of game wardens and he assigns them to the bird reservations. These would be Malheur, Klamath, and the Oregon coast refuges that had been established at that time. So the game wardens working on the bird reservations were paid by Biological Survey. They were supervised by the state. They enforced no hunting bans under state laws, monitored trapping activities, and enforced trespassing and encroachments. So in 1918, George Benson became a game warden on Malheur Bird Reservation. And he became, at this point in time, the US government went away from having state game wardens on bird reservations to having an actual refuge protector on there. And so in 1918, he becomes the first federal employee at Malheur Bird Reservation. So he was the refuge protector until he retired in the late 1940s. And Benson Pond is named after him. And he and his wife lived down at Benson Pond for a brief period of time. They also lived in the house that is now managed by the Friends Group. So that was one of the homes that they have. So the refuge expanded greatly in 1935 with funds from the development of the Civilian Conservation Corps. The US government purchased the Blitzen Valley for $675,000, would be about $67 million today. The Double O unit was purchased in 1942 from Martha Hanley, the widow. And she wanted it to come to the government because she wanted the wildlife habitat to be preserved. So she sold it for $116,000. And today we have the really diverse habitats that we have now. But as I mentioned, this was a remake of an article that went into the Crane newspaper about the purchase of the Blitzen Valley and the taxes that were paid to it. And so it's very interesting. William Finley came out at the time of when the land was turned over to the refuge. And at this point in time in 1935, it becomes Malheur Wildlife Refuge. That's the name of it. So he talks about how it was set aside, and then 25 years later, the lake dried up. And after a study of many regions by the Biological Survey, they identified that Malheur Lake should be #1 on a list to receive funds for restoring breeding and feeding areas that had been destroyed. But realize that this is during the Depression and the huge droughts that have hit across the US. And we know the lake fluctuated, so it was a good reason to put money here, but the lake wasn't just going to come up because somebody bought the Blitzen Valley. We all know how the waters fluctuate in the lake. But so in 1935, the US government invited the Civilian Conservation Corps to come to Malheur Refuge. The Blitzen Valley had been purchased with funds for the CCC, and so they had to do something with some CCC enrollees. And I'm going to go through this quickly so we don't run over too much. But the CCC was used to employ thousands of young men, 18 to 25 years of age. We know that some young men lied about their age, and as young as 14 came into the employment. They were enrolled to do a series of primarily construction projects across the US. And they worked on erosion, they planted trees. The CCC was run by the US Army. Young men who entered the CCC took high school classes, college classes. They learned skills that would later go on to take them into construction and engineering trades. We had a number of CCC enrollees visit while I was at the refuge, and they had gone on to own large construction companies across the country as a result of the skills that they learned while they were in the CCC. There were 3 camps: headquarters, Buena Vista, and 5 Mile Lane north of French Glen. A small spike camp went up on Malheur Forest when they went up there to cut trees for timbers for work projects. So they weren't just ordering wood from someplace, although they did purchase a lot of wood from the mill in town. The first camp at Refuge headquarters was in 1935, and a permanent camp was established there in 1936. So you can see the spring, and this would be the approximate area where the parking lot is today. Maybe up farther on the hill. No, it's up farther on the hill. And headquarters would be down here. So later, the permanent camp with the wood buildings was based east of where the fire bunkhouse is today, out on that flat. The last camp was closed in 1942 with the start of World War II, and many of the young men who were in the CCC in 1942 enlisted in World War II and just moved into that realm. They were already trained up by the Army. They had a great skill set, and many of them went into the engineering groups in the military. They were building bridges, things like that. It's interesting to note that the wood buildings associated with the camps at headquarters and Buena Vista were dismantled and were actually moved to Alaska to serve as barracks during World War II. So they lived on. So it's interesting to note that each camp brought about $5,000 into the local community. So it was big news when more camps were established. So they would send trucks into town for food, for lumber. There were a number of skilled craftsmen who were hired to build buildings. So all of the stone buildings on the refuge that were built by the CCC, there were a couple of gentlemen in Burns who were stonemasons, and they were hired to come out to the refuge to show the enrollees how to construct and build buildings with stones. So the same stone buildings in town that were built before this and after the CCC, those men were in charge of the construction of those buildings. And we all know what fabulous buildings they were. So each camp had 200 men and about $5,000 per camp. So $15,000 a month was generated in the local community because of the camps on the refuge. So there's a lot. I'm not going to read off everything. You can see buildings at headquarters in Buena Vista. You may not have known that a small portion of the French Glen Hotel was added on by the CCC. If you look at the building, you'll notice that the back of the hotel looks a little different than the front. Every bridge you drive across on the Blitzen River, with the exception of the one on the county road, was built by the CCC. And Page Springs Campground, where a lot of folks like to camp when they come to visit the refuge, was initially constructed by the CCC. It was part of the refuge and then later turned over to the BLM for their management. All of the diversion dams that we use to move water around the refuge and the main ditches and canals that we see today were constructed or improved by the CCC. Many of those ditches were constructed during the ranch era, but they were improved and made much larger by the CCC. So that's a lot. So here's a representation of some of the buildings on the refuge that stand today that were constructed between 1936 and 1942 on the refuge. And here I can share this with Janelle. So if you want to dive into more details about some of these topics, I highly recommend the book For the Love of Nature, The Adventures and Achievements of William L. and Irene B. Finley. It was published last year. It's Finley's grandson and his wife. If you are interested in the conservation history of Oregon, You have to read this book. It's phenomenal. You have to go to Sea Hill Press to purchase it, however. The majority of these books on here can be found at your local library. So I will share this with Janelle and she can share it with everybody else. And now for questions. And I'm gonna see what's in the chat.
Carla, thank you so much. I'm going to open it up first to folks in the room. Anyone in the room have questions that you'd like to ask of Carla? Everyone's just in stunned amazement at all the knowledge you just shared with us. Comments or questions from the room? Yes.
This is Cecil.
This is Cecil Dick. Can you hear him, Carla?
Well, not really. Hi, Cecil.
He's asking how you're doing.
I am doing fabulously. I live in Spokane, Washington now.
Great.
The question I have for you, at the Refuge headquarters, the last Native American who lived in 1946 or 47 by the name of Sadie. Last Native claim to live there. For new information.
So Cecil is sharing with us that in 1946 or 47 is when the last Native American woman lived in the Refuge headquarters area, and her name was Sadie Louie.
Oh, one of the Louis. Okay, that is great to know. Thank you, Cecil. Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of that knowledge didn't get shared with us while I was there, but I often wonder what the refuge area would look like if settlers had never come into the area. I just imagine it would have been absolutely amazing. So I wish I could turn back time.
Cecil has another bit to share.
Also, north of the Harney, by the Saddle Butte, down that road, that way, along the 10-mile slough, you'll see indentations in the ground.
Mhm.
Maybe 5 or 6 spots, maybe half a dozen sites along the whole road that goes up through the Highway 78. And to get over the Harney County, like the Burns area and stuff like that, you'll see indent 4 or 5 feet, maybe 3 or 4 of them together, scattered out. But that's where the habitat was in the winter time. Always saw them spots. I've always wondered what it was, so I started looking in campground in the valley.
Were you able to catch most of that?
I know there's so much incredible archaeology in Harney County that has not been captured by anyone. And really, if you look any place on the landscape, you can find that it's been touched by the human hand, and there were 11,000 years of that with the Native Americans, because we know that it's highly likely that burning was encouraged in the Blitzen Valley by Native Americans. We know other places it's been documented in Oregon, and I'm going to assume that the same thing happened in the Blitzen Valley, because the Great Basin wild rye responds really fabulously to burning, and you would notice that after a natural fire, and why not encourage it? So, but yeah, Cecil has a huge amount of knowledge trapped in his brain that I'm always pleased when he shares it with us. Thank you.
I know, my little coyote at Refuge headquarters. So I'm going to show you the spot where Prince Graham was shot.
Yep.
And I know that location, and just cover, not on where it actually occurred. And I have to come across the road one rank with a certain spot. And now I don't remember where it was. It was
I,
just might have lost the way by now.
yep. If
Maybe.
you, Edward Gray's book that he wrote about Pete French actually has a pretty decent map in there with the location of where Pete French was shot.
Wow. Cecil, thank you so much for sharing. Thanks for coming tonight. Anyone else in the room? We do have a couple of questions in the chat here I want to get to. Rick Vetter.
So, I just find it interesting that obviously couldn't find any beaver out in the flats, but there's evidence that they were in every drainage up in the forest. And they were trapped out of that landscape on the forest. And they were live trapped off the refuge later and brought up onto the forest in the 90s when I was to reestablish that population. And they are reestablished on parts of the forest, and trapping has been allowed again. It was banned for many years, but recently. And as we know, of course, the beavers are doing great, the refuge and.
It
Right.
is fascinating. So, you
Yeah.
know, I think that by the time Ogden got to the Harney Basin, they had come from the Snake River. If you read his diaries, they are fascinating, and they're in the bibliography that I'll share. He's really having a miserable time already, and they're running low on food, and there's 100+ people in his group, and it's not just fur trappers, it's their wives, it's their children, it's, you know, this is a small city that's moving across the landscape. And I think he just, when he got to the Harney Basin and the Northern Paiutes were unwilling to share any food with him, and I wouldn't have shared any food with them. What advantage was it? They weren't going to trade them anything that was useful. And they were here they were there in October, actually. So we're starting to get into a colder time of year. And I think everything was going wrong. And so he didn't spend very much time even trying to look for animals that could provide furs for them. And a lot of what they were focusing on was they were hoping that the Native Americans they encountered had already heard that they were looking for furs and would already have this abundant supply already for them that they could trade with them. And that didn't happen. And so he just moved on, and thank goodness he did.
Yeah. So I don't want to ignore the questions in the chat, but I do want us to be brief. It is already 5:15. So the one question that I do see here is from Ken, asking if the occupiers damaged many of the archaeological materials at Refuge headquarters. I'm sure a thesis one day could be written about the impact, the tangible and intangible impact of that event. But if you want to just briefly yes or no answer that question.
So as far as we can tell, they went through materials that were locked up. They did not damage anything that was in storage. But they did damage the archaeological site. Down by the fire bunkhouse, as well as digging up in the parking lot. And we worked with the Burns Paiute Tribe on restoration of that. They did a little bit of a plea deal, the guys that were running the big heavy equipment up in the parking lot, and didn't probably get what they deserved. So, but that's the way history goes sometimes. So.
Great. I want to mention that William Finley III and his wife Carol's book, For the Love of Nature, is actually now available for purchase through the Friends of Malheur. We just received our first shipment of those we have 25 copies. We are we have invited William and Carol to the Harney County Migratory Bird Festival. They're going to be here in April. We're really excited to have them with us on Saturday evening. We're going to do a bit of trivia, a bird call contest, and some other fun things as a part of the Saturday night program. And they're going to do 3 mini presentations about William Finley and his connection to Malheur and this region. And yeah, so we're just really excited about all of that.
It's a fabulous book. It's a
Yes.
fabulous book. There's so much in that book that I did not learn anyplace else when I was looking into Finley and Bowman. So, and it has some amazing photographs in it. So another reason to buy the book. So
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that endorsement. Sure. And thank you again, Carla, for joining us to give this presentation this evening. I know that I really enjoyed it. I can tell by the responses of the people in the room and various people in the chat that this is so rich and really deeply appreciated.
Well, the people who know me know I could talk for hours about this. So yeah. I especially love, the archaeology is amazing there and needs to be preserved and conserved. So, and in my new position, that's part of what I get to do. So I can't complain about it, but yeah. And I'm thrilled. So if you guys haven't spent time at Sod House Ranch, the Friends group does a cleanup there every August to get it ready for visitation. The birding in there is amazing during that time when the cleaning up is going on. So I encourage you to volunteer for that.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to plug one more time that this is going to be happening every month all year long. We have other programs. We did just launch the registration for a Raptor ID course that's going to be 5 weeks long. Please visit our website, malheurfriends.org, our Facebook, our Instagram social feeds, and always feel free to reach out directly to me. You can email me at friends@malheurfriends.org. And we just love being connected with all of our supporters passionate about Malheur. So thank you so much for coming tonight. And we hope to see you again next month.
Thank you, Carla. So good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Have a great night. Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.